I had always loved road trips. There was something about the open road, the ever-changing landscapes, and the freedom to stop whenever and wherever you wanted. This particular trip, however, was different. It wasn't one of those carefree adventures filled with laughter and good memories. No, this trip was one I'd never forget. And not for the right reasons. It was late October and the air was already biting cold. My friends, Jake, Mia, and Tyler and I, had planned this trip for weeks. The idea was to drive to a remote cabin, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of the city. A weekend getaway to unwind, disconnect, and share some laughs by the fire. The route, according to the GPS, would take us along a deserted stretch of highway before winding into the forested hills. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The car was filled with music, idle chatter, and the occasional groan from Tyler whenever Jake tried to sing along to the radio. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson, and for a moment I let myself relax. I remember thinking how beautiful everything looked, until the first strange thing happened. It started small. The GPS suddenly froze, its screen glitching for a second before going completely black. "Must have lost signal," Jake said from the passenger seat, tapping it a few times. He didn't seem concerned, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. "No big deal," I replied, forcing a smile. "The cabin isn't far. We'll just stick to the map." But the map wasn't much help either. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness enveloped the road, I realized the landmarks we were supposed to pass didn't match the map. A gas station marked as a key waypoint was nowhere to be seen, and the highway signs were odd, faded, barely legible. One of them was completely blank, as if time and weather had scrubbed away the words. "Are we lost?" Mia asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with nervousness. "No, we're fine," I lied. The truth was I wasn't sure anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead, its black asphalt shimmering faintly in the moonlight. It was too late to turn back, and there hadn't been another car in sight for miles. That's when we saw the figure. At first, it was just a dark blur at the edge of the headlights, standing on the shoulder of the road. As we got closer, the figure became clearer. A man, or at least it looked like a man, dressed in tattered clothes with his back turned to us. He stood completely still, his head slightly tilted, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Should we stop?" Mia whispered, her breath fogging the window. "No way," Tyler muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. I didn't blame him. There was something off about the man. He didn't turn around as we drove past, not even when the headlights swept over him. And yet, I swear, I felt his eyes on us. For the next few minutes, no one said a word. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the tires against the road. My heart was racing, though I couldn't quite explain why. It was just a guy, right? Maybe a hitchhiker or someone whose car had broken down. That's what I told myself. But then we saw another figure, and another, each one standing motionless on the side of the road, spaced far enough apart that we could only spot them as we got closer. Every time, the same eerie stillness, the same ragged clothing. And none of them ever turned to look at us, though I swear I could feel their gaze burning into my skin. "I don't like this," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither," I replied, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Something was wrong. The road didn't feel right anymore. It felt endless, as if we were driving in circles without even realizing it. The headlights barely seemed to cut through the darkness now, and the trees lining the road loomed taller, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes against the night sky. "Is it just me, or have we been driving forever?" Tyler asked, breaking the silence. He was right. By now we should have reached the turnoff for the cabin. But the highway stretched on, unbroken, with no sign of an exit or even a side road. Just the same haunting emptiness, the same motionless figures appearing every so often, like some kind of cruel, repetitive nightmare. And then, just as I was about to say something, the car radio crackled to life. It wasn't music, or even static. It was a voice, a low, distorted voice that sent chills down my spine. "Turn back," it said. The moment the voice came through the radio, a cold chill ran down my spine. "Turn back," it repeated, low and distorted, like it was being spoken through layers of static. No one said anything at first. I glanced at Tyler, who was gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. Jake, sitting in the passenger seat, turned the volume knob, but it didn't do anything. The voice stayed at the same unsettling volume. "Is this some kind of prank?" Jake finally asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Who the hell would be out here pulling pranks?" Mia shot back from the back seat, her eyes darting between the radio and the window. "This road is practically in the middle of nowhere." I reached for my phone, hoping to record the sound or at least check the GPS again, but the screen was still blank. Dead. The battery had been fully charged when we left, but now it wouldn't even turn on. I glanced at the others. They were checking their phones too, and the looks on their faces told me they were having the same problem. "Let's just keep driving," Tyler muttered, his voice tight. I didn't argue. There was something about that voice, about the way it sounded so deliberate, so certain, that made me want to follow its instructions. But the road ahead offered no other options. We couldn't turn back even if we wanted to. The highway was too narrow, the shoulders too steep. We were trapped. The figures kept appearing. Every few minutes, another one would emerge from the darkness at the edge of the headlights. Each was different, but they all had the same unnerving stillness, the same haunting presence. Some looked like men, others like women or even children, but their faces were always obscured, either turned away or hidden by shadows. Jake leaned forward, squinting at one of them as we passed. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" I asked. "Her face," he said, his voice barely audible. It didn't look right." "What do you mean, didn't look right?" Mia asked, her tone sharp. Jake hesitated, as if saying it out loud might make it more real. "It looked wrong, like her eyes were too big. Or maybe she didn't have eyes at all. I don't know." I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed quiet. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us, and the further we drove, the darker it became. The moon, which had been casting a faint glow over the landscape, was now completely obscured by thick, swirling clouds. The headlights barely cut through the darkness anymore, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to be leaning closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the edges of the light. And then the car began to sputter. "What's happening?" Mia asked, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know," Tyler said, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. "I just had this thing serviced last week." The engine gave one final wheezing cough before dying completely. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the road, and an oppressive silence settled over us. No, Tyler muttered, turning the key in the ignition again and again. Nothing. "What do we do now?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We wait," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe another car will come by." But we all knew that wasn't going to happen. We hadn't seen another vehicle in hours, and this stretch of highway didn't even feel real anymore. It felt like we'd driven into another world, a place where the rules didn't apply. "I'll check under the hood," Tyler said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "No way," Mia snapped. "You're not going out there." "We can't just sit here," Tyler shot back. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the argument. "Listen." Everyone fell silent. At first, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching on gravel. It was coming from somewhere behind us. Slowly, I turned to look out the back window. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, just at the edge of the taillights, A figure emerged. It was one of them. The figure stood there, motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, without warning, it started walking toward us. "Lock the doors!" I shouted, my voice shaking. Tyler scrambled to hit the lock button, and the soft click of the doors locking echoed through the car. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Is it looking at us?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the figure as it moved closer and closer. It stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the tail lights, its face still hidden in shadow. And then, as if sensing our fear, it raised a hand and pointed directly at us. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The air in the car felt heavy, suffocating, like the walls were closing in around us. And then the radio crackled to life again. "Leave," the voice said, harsher this time, "before it's too late." The voice on the radio was gone as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving us in deafening silence once more. None of us spoke. None of us dared to. Outside, the figure still stood at the edge of the taillights, its hand outstretched in that unnatural gesture, pointing directly at us. "What does it want?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. "We can't just stay here," Tyler said after a moment, his voice strained. "If the car won't start, we'll have to get out and push it off the road. We can't stay in the middle of the highway." "Push it?" Mia's voice rose in panic. "Are you insane? That thing is out there." "It's not doing anything," Tyler snapped. "It's just standing there." "Exactly," Jake cut in, his voice low. "Why isn't it doing anything? That's what makes it worse." My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay in the car, to lock the doors, and to never step outside. But as I glanced at the fuel gauge, a horrifying realization hit me. "We're out of gas," I said quietly. "What?" Tyler turned to look at me, his expression one of disbelief. I pointed to the gauge, which was now sitting firmly on empty. "We had half a tank an hour ago," I added, my voice shaking. "There's no way we burned through it that fast." No one had a response to that. "Okay, fine," Jake said, breaking the silence. "If we're stuck, then we call for help." "With what?" Mia snapped. "Our phones are dead, remember? None of this makes any sense." "Guys," Tyler's voice cut through our argument, quiet but urgent. We all turned to look at him. His eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, his face pale. Slowly, I followed his gaze, and my blood turned to ice. There were more of them now. At least a dozen figures had emerged from the darkness, their silhouettes barely visible in the faint glow of the taillights. They stood in a loose semicircle around the car, perfectly still, their heads tilted at that same unnatural angle. None of them moved, but their presence was suffocating. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "And do what?" Jake shot back. "Run. Where would we even go?" Before I could respond, there was a sharp metallic bang from somewhere outside the car. The sound echoed in the stillness, making us all jump. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. Another bang, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal creaking. It was coming from the roof of the car. "They're on top of us," Tyler whispered, his voice hollow. Panic surged through me. I twisted in my seat, trying to see out of the windows, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely think. And then, as if in answer to our terror, the radio crackled back to life. "They're coming," the distorted voice said. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Something heavy slammed into the car, hard enough to make it rock on its wheels. Mia screamed, Jake shouted something I couldn't make out, and Tyler fumbled with the keys, trying desperately to start the engine. And then the windows shattered. Glass rained down on us as dark, shadowy arms reached into the car, clawing and grabbing with unnatural speed. One of them latched onto Jake, dragging him halfway out of the window before he managed to kick it away. "Get out!" Tyler shouted, throwing open his door. "What? No!" I yelled, but it was too late. Tyler was already outside, swinging a tire iron at the nearest figure. The sound of metal striking flesh, or something like flesh, was sickening. I hesitated for a moment, torn between staying in the relative safety of the car and following Tyler. But when another shadowy arm reached through the shattered window beside me, I made my choice. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the door. We stumbled out into the freezing night air, the darkness around us alive with movement. The figures were everywhere, their twisted shapes flickering in and out of the faint light. Tyler was swinging the tire iron wildly, keeping them at bay, but they were closing in fast. "This way!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the trees. We ran. I don't remember how far or how long, but the sound of footsteps behind us never faded. The figures moved with an unnatural speed, their limbs twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, they seemed closer, their faceless heads tilting in eerie unison. "Where's Jake?" Mia gasped, her voice breaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. A sharp cry rang out behind us, and I knew without looking that Jake wasn't with us anymore. "We have to keep going," I shouted, forcing myself to move faster. The trees closed in around us, their gnarled branches forming a twisted canopy that blocked out what little light there was. The ground beneath our feet was uneven and littered with roots, but we didn't dare slow down. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the chase ended. We stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for air, and I realized the footsteps had stopped. The figures were gone. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. What just happened?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the radio crackled to life again. "You can't escape," the distorted voice said. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no sign of the car, no sign of the road, just the endless expanse of trees and shadows. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, a single figure stood, its faceless head tilted toward us. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. And somehow I knew. This wasn't over. The figure at the edge of the clearing didn't move. It stood there, a shadow against the darkness, its faceless head tilted in that same eerie angle that I'd seen so many times that night. "Is it watching us?" Mia whispered, clutching my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. "I don't know," I murmured, my voice barely audible. My body was frozen, every nerve screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Tyler stepped forward, gripping the tire iron in his trembling hand. "We can't just stay here," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to do something." "Like what?" Mia snapped, her panic finally boiling over. "What are you going to do, Tyler? Hit it? Did you see what happened back there? They don't stop." "We can't just wait for it to come for us," Tyler shot back, his voice rising. "Stop it," I hissed, cutting them both off. "Just stop. We need to think." But thinking wasn't going to save us. Not here. Not now. The rules we knew, the logic we relied on, it didn't exist in this place. Deep down, I knew that whatever was happening to us wasn't something we could fight or run from. The figure tilted its head further, almost as if it were mocking us. Then it raised its arm, slowly, deliberately, and pointed to the trees behind us. "What does that mean?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it wants us to go that way," I said, though the words felt ridiculous as they left my mouth. "Or maybe it's leading us into a trap," Tyler muttered. "Do we have a choice?" I asked, glancing at him. Tyler didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me he was just as lost as I was. Taking a deep breath, I turned toward the trees. "We have to move," I said. "Standing here isn't going to save us." Without waiting for a response, I started walking. The forest swallowed us whole, its dense, twisted branches closing in around us. The air was thick and heavy, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. I could hear Mia's ragged breathing behind me, Tyler's footsteps crunching on the dead leaves. But beyond that, nothing. No figures, no voices, just the endless expanse of trees. "Do you think we're going the right way?" Mia asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. We walked for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time didn't seem to exist in this place. My legs ached, my head throbbed, and every step felt heavier than the last. And then finally we saw it. A light in the distance, faint and flickering. "What is that?" Tyler asked, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. "I don't know," I said again. "But it's the only thing we've seen out here. We have to go." The three of us stumbled toward the light, our pace quickening as we got closer. It was coming from a small cabin, its windows glowing with the warm, inviting light of a fire. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But as we approached, that hope turned to dread. The cabin looked wrong. The wood was weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under the weight of time. And yet, the light inside was steady, as if someone, or something, was waiting for us. "Do we go in?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," Tyler said, stepping forward. He pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. The inside of the cabin was exactly what you'd expect, cozy, warm, almost inviting. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a table sat in the center of the room, set with 3 plates of steaming food. "Hello?" Tyler called out, his voice hesitant. No response. The 3 of us stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us. Mia screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. "Who's doing this?" Tyler shouted, his voice echoing in the empty room. Before anyone could answer, the radio crackled to life again. "You've arrived," the distorted voice said,